Many of us have been the recipients of broken promises. Maybe some of you have felt as though God has broken His promise to you. Broken promises, though, tend to be something that we feel. We feel it as human beings. And then our tendency is to project those feelings on to God. It's very easy to project our disappointments onto God. You know, we get lied to all of the time. In fact, it seems to be part of our culture. We have broken promises all around us, from broken relationships that involve broken promises, business contracts, even business contracts that are supposed to be friendly handshakes. We expect a little more. Those get broken. Promises are broken. How many of us growing up ever uttered the phrase to mom or dad, "Yeah, but you promised"? Been there, done that. "Yeah, but you promised." I did that with my parents. How many of you get frustrated when you feel as though a colleague or a friend or a family member has broken a promise seems to be broken, and then when you go to talk to that person then, in explaining just what has happened in the original promise, provided themselves a little wiggle room? I mean, pretty soon you get the sense that, yeah, but that wasn't the intent of what was going on. A promise is broken. But then that is denied. So all of our experience with promises and broken promises, then we project onto God. Oh, God, He's breaking His promises to me. You said that you would do this for me. And it seemingly He doesn't. Today our lesson from the Old Testament is all about promises. In fact, each of the Bible stories, if you notice, there seems to be a running pattern here. Been about promises. Genesis 3:15, when Adam and Eve sin, what does God do? He promises them an offspring that will come to fix the sin problem. Last week, Noah gets off the boat. There's a rainbow. Again, God promising that He is going to be true to His word, and that someday there will be a Messiah, someone who comes to be among His people and save them from their sin. So, this morning, we're looking at promises. As we get to Genesis 15, God has already promised Abraham the moon, basically. Here's how the story goes. Abram was living in a different country. He's 75 years old, and he gets a call from God one day. Not sure how that call shows up. God calls him away from his family, away from his friends, and says, "Hey, I've got a land for you." And so he goes. 75, picks up his family, and by this time he's fairly wealthy. He picks the whole thing up and he moves to a land we know as, it's called Canaan in the Scriptures, the land we now know as Israel. That little strip of land on the east side of the Mediterranean Sea. God promises to give Abram the land, and He promises Abram offspring. Offspring through which He will bless all nations. He's going to bless everybody through Abram's offspring. And that's all part of this big move from where Abram is, kind of northwest of Israel, down to Canaan. So Abram does it. The fly in the ointment, though, is Abram is 75. We've come to find out his wife Sarah, or now at this point Sarai, they both had their names changed. She's 65. Both getting up there, beyond childbearing years. And God has said, "I am going to bless the entire earth with your offspring. As numerous as the sand of the sea." Yeah, but how's that going to happen? I don't have the first kid. So Abram starts looking at his business manager, Eliezer. It's like, what about him? And we read this morning, God says, nah, it's not about him. I'm not going to bless the world through him. I'm going to bless him through you. It's going to be through you, your offspring. He doesn't have the first son. So how is that going to happen? And so as the years go by, as the years go by, there's still no son. We get to Genesis 15, and Abraham is still raising this point with God. I have no son. You've promised. It'd be very easy for Abram to look at God at this point and begin to think, does God keep his promises? Is God just setting me up for a big letdown? I don't know if I can trust God. But God comes along Abram's side and he tells him, you are going to have a son. Up to this point, he has simply used the word offspring. Now it's going to be a son. I'm promising you a son. He's going to have your DNA. And then God says, count the stars. Your offspring is going to be more than the stars that he can count. Then Abram's response to God coming alongside and saying, hey, you're going to have a son, count the stars, your offspring through this son is going to be as numerous as what you can see. His response is one of the most quoted verses in all of the Scriptures. You find it over and over again. Paul quotes it. James quotes it. The writer of Hebrews quotes it. You see, Abram, this isn't about you. You're going to have a son. You think you're too old, but you're going to have a son. And I'm going to do wonders through this offspring. But it's something that you cannot do, you cannot pay for. It cannot be worked for. The salvation of the whole world doesn't depend on you. And here's what the text says. The grand statement's in verse 6. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abram believes. He takes God at his word. And it is placed on his account as saving righteousness. He is made right with God. Abraham responds in faith. It's not because of the stars. Oh, yes, it is because of the stars, but it's because of that promise. And what happens next is beyond surreal. Because it's as if God is now going to come behind his promise to Abraham, and he is going to give him a sign. He's going to give him a sign that he cannot miss. It's one of the most remarkable events in all of Scripture. God follows up his promise to Abram by giving him this sign and a promise. Here's what our text said. He said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. So he brought all these to him, cut them in half, laid the pieces opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. Now all of this seems very, very strange to us. You know, when we're going to sit down, if you're going to sit down and make a contract as the Little League president, what do? You got a piece of paper, right? You're dealing with contracts all the time. You have a piece of paper, and the piece of paper has the details of what's being promised and what's not being promised a lot of times. And then, of course, there's always this really small font we call fine print. And the fine print's there because we don't trust that guy that's signing the paper. That's how we do contracts. Your signature, my signature becomes official. Back then, they didn't use paper. They used animals for their contracts, for their covenants. I mean, there really was something to these, what they call the blood covenant. The two parties do not take out a pen. They cut animals in two. In fact, the word covenant that is used in Genesis and throughout the Scriptures literally means to cut. To cut. cutting a covenant. It comes from this ceremony. In a formal covenant or contract ceremony, they would take an animal, flay it in pieces, and then split it up. Kind of like our tables there. Two sides. And then the two parties, together, between the animals, would walk side by side through the animals. And what that signified was, we're going to be true to our word. If either of us breaks the terms of our covenant, whatever that covenant or contract is, you can do to me what we've done to these animals. A life for life. A life for life. If you violate the covenant, you become as one of the dead animals. It's all symbolic. In this manner, the death of the animal is exchanged symbolically for the life of the person that's making the promise. The death of the animal signifies the curse of the covenant. This is what happens when you break covenant. When you break your promise, when you break your word, what happens to that animal then happens to you, or is going to happen to you. So God has Abram set all this up for a covenant between God and Abram. There are the two parties, having flayed the animals and lined them up. God and Abram are now going to walk through the pieces as the parties in this covenant. Only there's a twist. There's a twist here that becomes part of the story that reverberates all through the Scriptures. As the time draws near for the two parties to walk through the covenant, God puts Abram to sleep. You see, there's only going to be one party walking through these pieces. Verse 12. As the sun was setting, a deep, deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. As the sun disappears to the west, Abraham is in a deep sleep. So deep, it's called great terror and darkness. You see, there's a covenant to be made, but the terms are too big, too bad for Abram to walk through the pieces with God. Too impossible. The terms of this covenant are too stupendous. There's no way Abram's ever going to live up to those promises. In fact, this really is an act of grace at one level. Because God knows Abram's never going to live up to it. Because the terms of this covenant and any covenant that you see in the Scriptures, when God is making a covenant with a man, the terms of the covenant are perfect obedience, perfect completion. You better do it right. And what we know from Abram, a few years later, we get down the road in Genesis and he's already breaking covenant. He actually tries to fulfill the terms of the covenant using a servant lady in his house, having a son with her. Abram's a covenant breaker. Yet this covenant demands perfection. It's something he cannot do, so he is given total darkness and it's total terror. There's no hope for Abram. What a bloody mess. But the story doesn't end there. For Abram, you're thinking, oh my, how am I ever going to live up to this? And now I can't. And as Moses is writing this to the people he's writing it to, that's exactly what they're thinking. Abram, you've got to get up. You've got to do this. You've got to walk through those pieces. But Abram's in a deep sleep. The story does not end there. Because over the horizon comes a torch and a fire pot, this translucent glow. there's a ray of hope. Verse 17, when the sun had set, it was dark. A smoking fire pot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram. See, in the distance, against the black of night, into this terror, into this deep darkness, comes a torch and a fire pot, a fire. And pretty soon where Abram lays, pretty soon where those animals are, the whole place is lit up. The billowing smoke from the fire pot envelops the scene. And remember, Moses is writing this for people centuries later. And when they see this torch in the fire pot, they know exactly what that is. Oh, that's the fire cloud that led us out of Egypt. This is the pillar of fire. This is the cloud of glory that descends on the tabernacle and the temple later on. This is God's presence himself. They've seen this before. That's who comes and walks between the two pieces for Abram. You see, Abram can't walk through the pieces, but God can, and God does. And he's not doing it simply for himself as his party. At this point, God is representing Abram himself by walking through those pieces on behalf of Abram. As the torch and fire pot move through the pieces, God is making good, and he is bringing about for Abraham a sign that I am going to make good. I am going to be as good as my word on these promises. You will have a son. I am going to give you all this land. Your posterity is going to be as numerous as the sand on the sea and the stars in the sky. And if the covenant is broken, guess who gets the treatment? God's not only saying, I'm going to bless. By walking through those pieces, he's also invoking the curses onto himself. If the covenant is broken, God himself will be treated as the covenant breaker, undergoing the curses of the covenant, just like those sacrificed animals. God will be slaughtered on behalf of the others. So yes, Abram will be the beneficiary of a great and glorious covenant, of an everlasting covenant. But Abram cannot execute the terms of that covenant. It's impossible for him to do. No, this must be done by the only one who can do it, the one who is there in the torch and the fire pot on behalf of Abram. Now, Abram does have a son. Abram ends up with a nation of people. But even that son, even those people are letdowns. They're covenant breakers. At some point, there will be an offspring, a son who comes, who invokes on himself the curses of the covenant breaker. And he will die the death of a covenant breaker for Abram and everybody who follows after Abram in faith. The missionary Paul tells us in a letter to a faith community around the city of Rome. He says this, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. While we were still sinners, while we were asleep on the ground in terror and darkness, our torch and our fire pot walked through the pieces. While we were asleep and dead, there appeared our own torch and our own fire pot, walking into the bloody mess to die on our behalf. Some of you may think that God has let you down. Maybe you feel like God didn't hold up his end of the bargain. Many of us have had that thought. When you have that thought, then you come back to this. You come back to the fire pot. When you have those thoughts that God breaks promises, first of all, you need to know that's the serpent speaking. You need to remind the serpent, and you need to remind yourself that God is not a promise breaker. He is a promise keeper. And we know that because he died as a promise breaker on our behalf. While we were sinners, the torch and the fire pot died for us. Having walked through the pieces on the desert floor with Abram, he now incurs all of our sin on the cross. He's flayed to pieces as a covenant breaker. You see, Christ walked the covenant walk that we could not walk. Christ died for us as a covenant breaker, and in dying for us, gave us the life that we could not have lived if left to ourselves. We end up, because of what Christ does, because Christ dies as a covenant breaker, it's as if we've never, ever, ever broken covenant between us and God. We are forgiven our sins. We are given our lives by the one who became the fire pot and the torch for us.